Hello and welcome to another ASCM LinkedIn Live. Today we are going to be discussing the recent sanctions on Russia and how they're going to impact supply chains throughout the world. Some of you may hear about these sanctions in the news, and there are various rippling effects that they're going to have on the supply chain worldwide. So we have two experts with us today to discuss some of those issues. We have Kim Daniels, CEO of Mercantile Logistics and International Trade. She's going to bring that really good trade compliance perspective to the sanctions that are going to impact supply chains. And we have Dr. Nick Vyas, founding executive director of the Ronald R. Kendrick Global School of Supply Chain Institute at the University of Southern California. So we have a great academic mind on tap for today as well. I'm going to jump right into the questions that we have for today. First one, Kim, I'll start with you. Just in general for our audience, what kind of effect are these sanctions going to have on supply chains?
So far, they're already having a significant effect. If you haven't noticed, the gas prices have increased quite a lot. But mostly when it comes to any kind of supply chain problem, it doesn't like change. Supply chains don't like change. And when you sanction, when you add a tariff, whatever it is that you do, the supply chain will feel it. So in the case of Russia, what we're running into is, potential issues with containers being able to stop at safe ports if they're actually safe when they end up in Russia. So those are some of the issues. You have to also be careful of potential fallout from those countries. So, if you're depending on an import from a sanctioned country and you start bringing in goods, you're looking at potentially losing your complete supply. If you're an exporter, you're losing sales. And this can be hundreds of millions of dollars worth of sales that it costs the country. The thing about sanctions is they're a very blunt instrument when it comes to engaging the global community in complying with what our ethics and our requirements are for legal activity. In the case of Russia, we have where, there's been some very bad consequences of big decisions that were made when they started to attack the neighboring Ukraine. And those kinds of issues is what prompted us and a lot of the rest of the world to say, hey, you can't do that. We're going to punish you if you don't stop. Unfortunately, it's not working. It's a very blunt instrument in which to punish them. You might be able to get a little bit of movement, but they can actually hurt both sides of that equation.
Right. Dr. Vyas, from your perspective, in general for our audience, what do you think are going to be some of the impacts on supply chains as a result of these sanctions?
So Matt, I think what we have to sort of look at these things in a context, right? So let's go back post Second World War. Relatively, our civilization, humanity has seen sort of a peaceful transition into being able to resolve some of the major conflict, although we had some disputes here and there, some wars, but nothing significant as of what World War I and II would have done, right? So from that standpoint, about 75 years of making this supply chain in a very harmonized trade policies created what we now enjoy, the global integrations of both supply and demand, right? So last 40 years of prosperity that we have seen was actually the benefits of supply chain being completely in sync with both on the supply side as well as the demand side. So if we set that as a sort of a background of how things started to become globally interconnected, it gives us a perspective of how important the supply chain has been. So now let's fast forward to 2 years ago, 28 months ago exactly, right? 2020. Here we are, a pandemic of the century comes and hits us and literally knocks the entire world on its knees, right? Did not discriminate socioeconomic status, religion, geographic boundaries, or anything. We literally had a huge shock. And then now we look back 24 months, we're still unstable with these shocks, both on the supply side and the demand side. And on the top, now we introduce geopolitical disputes. which is a Russia and Ukraine conflict, right? So the system was almost gasping for air and it was on the life support. And here we comes with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And what this is doing truly is literally almost putting the last, what I call this as the last straw that broke the camel's back. So our supply chains are very, very fragile at this point. And to Kim's point, supply chain doesn't like change. Well, you think about it, the financial flow hates uncertainty. Money does not flow where there is a friction. And supply chain is driven by the financial flow. And the sanctions are literally now questioning, did we do this 40 years of this harmonious ways of globalization and integrated supply chain? Are those the best way to run the future supply chain? So creating this gigantic question over and beyond what we dealt with the COVID is the geopolitical. So the sanctions, to me, which is less than effective, it has been less than effective with the tariffs that we've seen imposed over the last 8 years in our country against China. Didn't do much, to be honest with you. I think the sanctions are very ineffective ways to handle this. All it does, it throws more uncertainties. And I think the byproduct of that is what we're dealing with. This conflict suddenly heightens the awareness of our understanding of supply chain network design and questioning, have we done the right things and what are the structural deficiencies of the last 4 decades that we need to revamp and readjust and repivot.
So that reminds me, Kim, you said this in another session that we did where supply chains could be viewed as that broken vase that was glued back together. And if you pour water in, the water starts to seep out. And then the pandemic perhaps overfilled that vase. And on top of that, Dr. Vyas, as you said, the sanctions just kind of had an even greater effect. Are there
it basically broke the vase?
Yeah, essentially.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing is I'm getting a sense that, you know, some consumers, other than inflation or the high gas prices, they haven't yet seen they haven't yet felt all the effects of these. Would you say that that's the case at this stage, and there's more to come down the pipeline that could have an impact on not just supply chain managers, but also the end customer?
Oh, in my view, Matt, I think this is going to be protracted, long drawn out, and the consequences, or what I would say unintended consequences, could be severe. Because you think about our world runs on the energy. Russia and Ukraine is close to 20% of the supply of the world energy. EU is dependent on the energy sources. Many of the African continents and other countries are dependent on this. So if you disrupt that, so think about the inflations, what we're seeing now, and drawn out and protracted war and sanctions continues to impact that. It sucks out the wind from the global economy. There's already World Bank projecting 1% reduction of GDP globally of this Russia-Ukraine conflict. Can we take another 1% if it draws out another 12 months? That would be disastrous from what we have already faced over the last 2 years. So in my view, if this does not get resolved in the near term, so the short-term horizon, I think we have a huge headwind that really will bring us to the recession if we are not already seeing our ways into it.
I agree with that. I think one of the things to keep in mind is that it's much easier to implement tariffs and sanctions than it is to suspend them. So we have, issues with, like, for example, you brought up China. We have these tariffs against China that have really just exacerbated our economic issues and have not hurt China at all. In fact, our disparity with them on trade is even higher than when they started. And I think a lot of people fail to realize that, oh, well, we moved our company, we've moved our sourcing. You may have, but it doesn't mean that your sourcing agent has. It doesn't mean that whoever you're buying from in the Philippines doesn't still import from China. So, you're not really doing any changes. With Russia, there's this great article I mentioned to you earlier, Matt, if you want to share that, specifically that talks about some very interesting things that happen in sanctioned activity. And that could be in oil trade, it could be in, money trade, it could be in, I'm sorry, all kinds of other issues when it comes to the actual transportation of goods. Like I said earlier about Safeport, OFAC was designed specifically to make sure that we're following with what USTR, U.S. trade representatives, have deemed necessary to try to get compliance from those countries that are being punished. But the biggest problem is there's a macro effect and there's a micro effect. The macro effect affects both countries, but the micro effect is for those, it can be all the way down to that individual who just made a sale, or is selling, like we have a lot of agriculture and they're selling to Russia, or we have a lot of products that they might find in the Russian market they want, and now that sale has to be suspended because of force majeure. So this is something that it's not. Sanctions are not something to be entered into lightly. And while I understand that the government was, punishing and using punitive ways to punish another country that was acting poorly, it still punishes everybody else that is involved in the supply chain, which comes down to that individual consumer.
Yeah, thank you for that extra insight to give an idea of how it might have some later impacts on consumers. And that is a good segue to the next question. One thing I want to say to everyone on the chat line, I have a few questions for the panel. If you have any questions you'd like to ask, I'm going to invite everyone to ask them towards the end. You will have an opportunity for live questions for either Kim or Dr. Vyas. But my next question is, we've heard of companies pulling out of Russia. There's more that happens when a company pulls out of a country, particularly one with that much economic force. What other impacts are we going to see to supply chains as a result of, say, companies leaving?
One of the biggest ones that I've been recently informed of through a conference I was at a couple of months ago was that when you abide by U.S. sanctions, you may be violating the laws of the country being punished. And that can create some serious legal discord for the people that you work with in those countries. So if you have a manufacturing plant or a Starbucks in Russia, and now you have to close it all down, you could be violating Russian law simply by doing what the U.S. law is demanding that you do. So there's definitely some issues and implications that you have to be worried about with that.
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Vyas, if you have some insight on that.
So we know to date about 700 institutions, the companies, multinationals, have curtailed their operations out of Russia, right? So for the large Fortune 500 companies, this is sort of an entry in their journal about writing off the losses. McDonald's being the biggest, as an example, if we can articulate that, right? You can shut down the operations, leave all your assets, walk away, book that as your loss, a capital loss, and move on with it, right? But let's understand this in the context of how, on the fall of Berlin Wall, we actually invited Russia to participate in an open market, create this what we call integrated global supply chain network, right? It took us 30 years to get to where we were. And in less than 6 months, we've completely abandoned and, right? So one has to think about what are the long-term ramifications of this? It's easier to fold something, but it takes decades to reestablish that footings, right? So we have to think from the standpoint, is Russia big enough or even small enough for us to ignore it for a long period of time? And an idea here, think about 29% of the wheat comes from this region, right? 20% of our energy source come from this part. 17 to 18% in some estimation, the corn comes from it. So if you think from the caloric intake of countries, Middle East, Africa, Asia, these commodities, agriculture commodities, it's about 60% of their caloric intake. And you simply cannot overnight substitute that demand from anywhere else. And so my concerns are the companies can really easily pull in and out, but how are we going to impact long term? And my recommendation here really is the yes, companies are forced to do this because they have an obligation to follow the sanctions that have been imposed by the US and the European Union. But hopefully the cool heads prevails about thinking the long-term implications, and then we can sort of come together and sort of have this conversation and keep the back channels of diplomatic communication so that we can minimize its impact, both the short term and the long term.
I think another really good point to make specifically to using sanctions is to use them as sparingly as possible. I think what we find is that recent administrations have been using them like a bat. You can grab a bat from any store and just start pummeling away, and that seems to be what they've been doing with sanctions and with tariffs. And what they don't understand is that this isn't just let's go and get them with this one tool. There's got to be a lot of other diplomatic tools that can be used that don't affect your microeconomies.
You are supply chain experts, not diplomats, so I won't start asking you about different tools or alternatives to sanctions. But Dr. Vase, you also provided a good segue to the next question. And people on the chat line, think about questions you may have, because I have only 1 to 2 more for our panel here. We talked a little bit about the short-term impacts, and we've seen some of them, and we talked about the short-term impacts that might happen from supply chain managers, consumers in the near term. Take a look at the long-term impact. Let's say about 1 year. I'll let you indulge us, maybe even 2 to 3 years, if you'd like. What other impacts are we going to see long-term to supply chains as a result of these sanctions?
So Matt, I've written this about even before the COVID. In 2014, I published a white paper about structural deficiencies of our supply chain networks. And the hypothesis that I articulated then was simply, are we too dependent on a single node? Mm-hmm. Have we gone too far in creating this long string supply chain focused on a one country, one node? And answer is, if you look at our last 35 years, we became very one country sourcing dependent. China became the world's manufacturing hub. Some of the commodities, we later find out in 2020 during the COVID disruption, that close to 95% of some SKUs were coming out of this one country. All of a sudden, we realized that at the cost of only focusing on total cost of goods sold and the margins of profit margins, mm-hmm. we gave up the resiliency, agility, and by the way, the sustainability. So what I call the long-term implication of the triple bottom line mindset that we let go on a corporate greed of just the profit over the last 35 years, we need to start to think about how do we design our supply chain, our sourcing strategies, our manufacturing strategies, and have some sort of regional nodes. And by the way, when I said decoupled supply chain, I do not intend to even have a slightest hint about deglobalization. I think globalization has done great things to the humanity. Mm-hmm. What I am proposing, decoupled supply chain, is the regional, shorter supply chain that delivers reasonably priced goods and services, but also strikes the balance of resiliency and sustainability. So that's a triple bottom line mindset that the leadership, the government, the board, it's going to have to sit back and evaluate these things. Listen, if we do not learn from the COVID disruptions, if we do not learn from this geopolitical between Russia and Ukraine, there are other hotspots of geopolitical disruptions that can likely happen, will happen. It's not, is it going to happen? It's just a matter of when is it going to happen? And then the last thing on this triple bottom line, if we don't learn from the disasters that we've been faced for the last 28 months, I'll tell you, we have a pretty dark scenarios being planned on the sustainability related issues, right? If you believe it, even slightest, the evidence of current trends that we see on the environmental impact, the weather changes, and so forth, I mean, they're profound. And if the supply chains are not designed to circumvent or at least minimize the impact, I think we can find ourselves as a species. And I have this philosophy, planet Earth will be here. Human species may disappear. So it's not about us protecting the Earth. It's us protecting us as a species. And we need to be intelligent. So I think the long-term implication, and I know I'm drawing this dire picture here, but I think as an intelligent species, what we consider as a human species, we need to use this as a backdrop to think differently, think intelligently. We have a capacity, we have a technology, we have great minds. How do we now create a new design of our supply chain network that is shorter, agile, reasonably sustainable, so we can actually manage the next 40 years and beyond for the future generations and leave the legacy much different than what we are today going to show.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. I think that I mean, I like to be a little more positive about the future, but it usually bites me later. But I find that we could develop a more holistic solution. I think that Dr. Vyas is right that globalization is really good for humanity. You have certain sectors of the globe that are better at some things than others, whether it's because of their position with, agriculture, or it's specifically their government or their way of life, or whatever it is that makes them just really good. I think we do focus too much on one country, and we could make that a more holistic type of environment to where we say, hey, this country's good at this country's good at this country's good at this, and kind of get them all to work together. excuse me, to find a better solution, so we're not putting all of our eggs in one basket. And I do think that is our biggest issue, is that it is so easy to source from one location. But when something happens with that one location, whether it's, a sanction against Russia or it's tariffs against China or whatever, you're sourcing from one location, you're going to get hurt. And that's putting all your eggs in one basket. And that's why they say don't do that. I think another long-term effect and impact to all of the supply chain and everyone involved is trust. I think that how you manage and mitigate some of the risks that you're dealing with in the supply chain is really going to dictate how successful you can be in the future. If you can continue to maintain trust, whether it's with your suppliers or your buyers, or with your personnel and all in between, such as your forwarders and your ocean carriers. If you cannot maintain that trust, the whole thing's going to collapse, and that vase is going to be obliterated.
I'm seeing a lot of concurrence on the chat line with sustainable approaches, which, as you mentioned, we talk about some of the long-term effects that rather we kind of coalesced around a solution to what we've seen. So it's not just the pandemic, or rather not just these sanctions, which is just the topic at hand, but also the pandemic. But things that taught us we need to have more localized supply chains and not be so dependent on a given region. That's the major takeaway I'm getting, and concurrence along the chat line. With the time that we have left, there is one question in so far, and feel free if you have any more. Do we have transparency over the real dependencies in our supply chain, or is it just one of the tasks that we have to tackle?
We do not. We actually don't. We don't really have real transparencies. We have, as a customs broker, I can tell you, I only know what I'm told. I am told that goods come from a certain factory, they come into the United States, they're going to a certain location, and they are this particular commodity. I could be told something. That's where trust comes in again. I could be told something completely wrong. I could be lied to, and all I can do really is try to vet everybody that I work with as far as I possibly can to make sure that they're legitimate companies. And I do, of course, my due diligence. But when it comes to a transparency system, no one has built that tool yet. There are ways to do it, which I'm working on, but no one has actually done that yet. I also wanted to ask Dr. Bias, is there's something I was thinking about the other day. 100 years ago, we had the Spanish flu, and then we had World War I. Do you think that this is somehow cyclical and one leading into the other?
So Kim, you bring up a very good point. I'm about to publish a common sense supply chain article. And one of the hypotheses I'm trying to articulate there is, are we seeing with this geopolitical conflict that we are talking today, is this going to form a new world order, right? And then some part of that can lead to, are we on the verge of the formation of the Cold War like we dealt with, right? So if you look at the Spanish flu into World War I, questions have been actually articulated. Are we going to go into the World War III, right? So I think that's a very legit question. In my view, what I feel, we are certainly forming a new world order in which the democratic countries and its value system is being challenged for two reasons. One, the effectiveness. Let's talk about that first. Are we really preaching the democratic values are much more effective in terms of the execution of day-to-day governance? I think the debate can be made that we are paralyzed with overly debating about things which are common sense, that one would say we need to get things done. However, because of the political parties, let's look at this country, our country, in the United States, are common sense issues that should be drawn without party affiliation. We can't seem to come to the conclusions because it's a bad idea if it comes from the other side. And that paralyzes the governance model. And we see this trickling down across the larger Western democracies. And I think, so that is a concern of mine, that in this new world order formation, if we drift away without being conscious about how far we're drifting, it can lead to conflict, severe conflict, right? There's a potential conversation about China-Taiwan conflict.
Right.
Russia, China combining with other countries, like-minded countries, that they say, hey, we don't subscribe to EU and US ideology. All of a sudden, when you start to build onto this thing, we can see two camps emerging out of this and could create a serious issues to the peace that we have enjoyed since the World War II. So I'm hoping that I'm wrong, and
I am too.
Of not drifting too far away on these things. But Matt, I want to get back to your sustainability. Listen, go back to the Silk Route, 1,000 years ago, old Silk Route. The trust was always, back then, it was a handshake, right? You travel across the Silk Route and Kim would buy something from me because she knew that if I transact with Nick, it's a legit goods with a legit delivery and value system. Supply chains have always relied and dependent on it, but we have relied on a manual mechanisms. But let's just come back to it. I mean, I've written a book on blockchains and the supply chain. We have a technology today that can help us become much more transparent. That can help us become much more sort of a traceability-wise and transaction-wise, much more legit, and remove the trust as a variable, because we can trace it accurately and make things much more effective. The government and the like-minded trading partners, they all need to come together and make this as a priority. right? Some financial institutions migrated to cloud. Today, you and I, and 98% of our human beings, we transact on the financial system that communicates than how we did 100 years ago. Can supply chain transition to that? Well, we need standards, we need adaptation, we need like-minded governments to come together and support private industry to take that next step. I think Europe is doing much better job at this in terms of the traceability and sustainability than we do. Again, we are caught up in this lobbying and too many debates, and then we have elections and the new government comes and all the previous government's work is thrown out. So all this, what I call the lack of common sense approach, is really boggling us down to this politics rather than execution. So I think it's a real issue. We need the traceability, we need the transparency, but we need to rely not on manual mechanisms, but the technology that is capable of delivering that.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually, and we have time for one more question. And this, what you said ties a thread to this question, particularly since you mentioned blockchain and traceability. But one person asked, will these sanctions encourage some sort of dark parallel supply chain? And Dr. Vyas, since you kind of touched on that and talked about blockchain and traceability, I'll let you tackle that one first.
Oh, absolutely. Listen, the human species, we are very intelligent. We always circumvent and come up with the creative solutions. And absolutely, there are ways to bifurcate and mitigate all of the sanctions, and they've been done. Russian government has been able to withstand. If you look at the original forecast by World Bank about the likely impact of sanction back in November to now, you look at it in June, they're fraction of what the intended consequences were supposed to be. And the reason being, because they've been mitigated and there is a parallel system of trade and transfer of money. So every sanctions you impose, there's 3 more ways to minimize the impact of that. And every single one of those been utilized in this case. So yeah, absolutely. I think it creates almost ineffective ways to handle the situation at hand.
Yeah, digitizing the supply chain will definitely be something that we need to look at in moving money towards, specifically to provide transparency, whether it's to the government or simply to, brokers. Not that this is, completely selfish, but there's a lot of things that we don't know. We don't have, we have to use trust and faith. We don't have anything specific and concrete to point to say, look, I was told cotton t-shirts. It's not my fault. It's cocaine. Right. So that's one of the things that our resources as humanity needs to go to, specifically to create a digitization process for the global supply chain. And it's a large, tall order. But I think that if we could get everyone behind it and get that idea of, hey, not only is the importer made aware of this and the government's made aware of this, but the people in the middle are made aware of this. And that's something that needs to be considered specifically for the blockchain scenario, because that technology is the best technology to provide for that scenario. I think that we can use that as a way to make sure that there's not illicit things happening. And the dark supply chain is something that might happen, but it'll be a lot more complicated and a lot more expensive than the legitimate supply chain.
All right, great. Thank you so much for your insight. We are a little over time today because it was such a rich discussion. We had great questions, but I want to thank you both for giving your time to our audience today, providing some great feedback on how these sanctions are going to have a short and lasting impact on supply chains. If you didn't get your question in, or you're watching this after it has gone live and you have a question for one of our panelists, feel free to shoot it to research@ascm.org, and I will get it to Kim Daniels and Dr. Nick Vyas. Until then, thank you both for your time, and thank you everyone on the chat line for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.